even though it's a blowout, I said the Eagles play Dallas twice. I want to watch them closer, and they're playing the Saints next week. So I sat and kind of watched that game. And what I saw was a lot of awesome. They got really good play design. Some of the stuff they do is really cool. Some of the stuff they do is really creative. They hide a lot of stuff behind the line. They got a lot of movement going on back there. And what they do with Shaheed, it's going to be interesting when we talk to Andrew about how do they match up with him in the secondary. When you got a guy that fast, and he's not a big, fast guy. He's a guy that he does it down the seams. He does stuff where you got to find out where he is. Who's matching up with a guy like that? I mean, that to me is a matchup that is a big problem for me. We're going to talk to Andrew DiCecco from InsideTheBirds.com. Andrew, before you came on, I was talking about, we talk about the matchups with you on these Thursdays. There's a lot of matchups in this game that I don't really like on the surface. And the one that I was kind of talking about before you jumped on with us here is I watched that whole game last week. And I don't know who in this Eagles secondary is going to match up with Shaheed and what he does and how they get him open. That first matchup there is the Eagles and how they match up with this New Orleans pass game, which has been very explosive.
Yeah, there really isn't anyone on the Eagles that's equipped to do that. If I had to guess, Mike, it would be Quinyon Mitchell that's going to draw that assignment with Slay garnering Chris Olave in coverage. That's the way that I kind of draw it up. But the Saints can really spread you out, and they can really beat you in a multitude of ways. Obviously, Shaheed is an explosive downfield threat. That, to me, is where the game could be won. But I also don't like the matchup on the offensive line, the defensive line, considering the way the Eagles are playing right now on the defensive line. The Saints have one of the better offensive line units in the NFL through 2 weeks, so that's important for context. But Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, Lucas Patrick, who came over from the Bears. They had Trevor Penning at right tackle, who I know a lot of folks were down on last year, but he's starting to seems like he's starting to come into his own. And then, of course, on the left side, they have Talise Fuaga, who is a first-round pick this past April from Oregon State. So they have a lot of pieces there, and the Eagles' defensive line is not playing with a ton of confidence right now. They're not getting off the ball very well. So if they weren't able to get home against the Falcons, well, this could be some tougher sledding.
Yeah, good breakdown on that. That's the one that I look at. And you just said a couple things, but I want to go a little deeper. Obviously, the secondary matchup there, I love Olave. You mentioned Shaheed. But the pass game, how much more does it concern you? You talked about the offensive line, but the Eagles' pass rush, they're 30th in the league in pass rush efficiency. Not good. They're only getting pass pressure 24% of the time. This doesn't feel like the week where that's going to turn around.
No, I don't think so, and that's troubling because obviously for Vic Fangio's defense to work, the pass rush has to get home where you at least have to pressure the quarterback and not allow them to stand back there and pick you apart in the intermediary levels, because in the past, whether it be Jonathan Gannon or even, of course, last season, teams have been able to do that when you're not able to get home. And you remember how many quarterbacks in consecutive weeks under Gannon were able to kind of pick you apart with a high efficiency. And to me, I think Derek Carr will be able to do that if you're not able to get pressure with Bryce Huff, if Josh Sweat can't get home, if Nolan Smith is invisible again. That's going to be a big-time problem. And I just don't see any evidence, at least on tape, that the Eagles are going to be able to break out of that funk. It's just not a good matchup.
Andrew, do you feel that the pass rush is coming, or do you look at this personnel and say, I don't know where they will generate consistent pass rush this season?
Well, that was my number one concern going into the season. If you remember, that was the one element that I pinpointed. I said, almost word for word, how are they going to manufacture consistent pass rush? I didn't see one player that you can kind of pinpoint and say that's going to be your double-digit sack guy. And right now, I'm even more confused and sort of has some more trepidation as to where that pass rush is going to come from through the Eagles, because I just don't think that they're going to be able to provide any resistance in the passing game throughout the season. I mean, Josh Sweat to me is probably your best bet right now, someone who has done it before. But I mean, the early returns this season have not been favorable. Brandon Graham had a really good summer, and he's been effective in his opportunities this season thus far. But he's 36 years old. I don't know if that's fair to expect him to be able to keep up that level of play throughout the entirety of the season. It's very simple. You need Bryce Huff to be able to get home. He is your $51 million a year $51 million guy, 17.5 million a season. He's got to be able to get home, and he is not getting off blocks. He's taking poor angles. They're tight ends that are erasing him out of the play. He's getting washed out in running plays. It just doesn't look like there's a ton of effort there, and that's problematic because they put all of their eggs in the Bryce Huff basket, obviously casting away Hassan Reddick. So that one right there is obviously the biggest problem on the defense right now, in my opinion.
Andrew, it's great breakdown. I want to get you a little further on Huff. I didn't like the signing when they made it. I was like, I don't know that this is, you got a guy, 10 sacks. He's replacing Reddick. And I wasn't even saying that he was going to be this bad, but just that's a lot to ask. Like, if you think you're going to replace Hassan Reddick, that's a big ask for a kid like that. What are you seeing from Huff, and do you think that he can be better, or do you think they signed a guy that just, I don't want to say a bust, but is not going to be the guy they were hoping for?
Well, I appreciate the way that you led that for the first part of your question, because it's hard for a lot of folks to appreciate the amount of pressure that's placed on a player when they have an immense amount of expectations placed on their shoulders, and they're replacing someone in Hassan Reddick who played 800-plus snaps the past 2 seasons and 70-plus, and he's beloved here in the city of Philadelphia. Yeah, he's well compensated. I get all that, but when you're not getting answers early and you're getting asked questions, or you're hearing that the general consensus is wondering whether or not you can play or be an every down player. I mean, I don't know that he was even ready for that, but to me, I haven't seen enough, Mike, for me to be able to see or gauge whether or not he can be that every down player. I think he's probably best used situationally, which obviously is not going to be the case here in Philadelphia, given the way he's been compensated. But I just don't know that he has it in him to be a consistent 3-down player. Not really good against the run. And, I mean, to be honest with you, it looks like after that past game that there was a lack of effort there. It just seemed like he wasn't really trying to overpower the tight ends. He wasn't really trying to factor back into a running play. And when teams were gouging them up the middle, the edge rushers were getting stuck inside, and they weren't setting the edge. So there's a lot of problems there, which enough for me to suggest that he can't do it.
I don't want to label him a bust either, but are you ready to write off Nolan Smith as a guy that you've lost some confidence in?
Well, I would be a hypocrite knowing how much of an advocate I've been for giving young players the opportunity to really grow into their role, and knowing that young players develop at different rates. And for Nolan Smith, he hasn't played a lot of football. He played 16% of the snaps last season, and this year the early returns have not been good. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I've seen spurts of optimism that should warrant some optimism. He has to play a lot better. But I still think I'm willing to give him another week or two before you start to have some concerns. For me, he needs reps. He also needs to get a little bit stronger. He's been able to win largely through athleticism. He's always been able to kind of elude the tackles, but he's really lacking in terms of hand usage. That's where, to me, he's most behind, and he's going to have to refine that area of his game if he wants to have any sort of success rushing the passer. But I'm still not ready to throw that label on him yet, Mike. I don't think that's fair to Nolan, but I will say that the clock is ticking.
Andrew DiCecco, Football at 4 from the Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. Looking at the matchups, I agree with you. I've been disappointed in Nolan. I don't want to label him a bust yet or write him off, but you're looking for where can you manufacture pass rush in-house. So far, you're looking around and saying, I don't know that I can find anything in-house here, but the guy on defense that maybe – go ahead.
You maybe could get some linebackers going. Obviously, that's not a viable long-term solution, but Devin White is an exceptional blitzer. For me, if it were me making the call, I would have Devin White active this week, knowing that he can blitz, he has some athleticism. Maybe you try to switch things up, depending on how you decide to use Zach Bond. Zach Bond has been an edge rusher before. He has 2 sacks. Maybe if you're really trying to reach deep into your bag of tricks, you try to throw something at him off the edge with a Zach Bond, or send a Kobe up the middle, or try to do things like that, because whatever they're doing right now, Mike, is just not working. So I think when you have those 3 linebackers that I mentioned that can rush the passer and can affect the play in that way, it's something worth exploring.
Okay, that'll be something. We'll see. One other guy on defense before we flip over to the offensive side of the ball, Andrew. Jalen Carter, disappointment. Our team's, paying more attention to him. how would you kind of look at the first 2 games for a guy who, a lot of people looked at and said, man, what a great start to the season he had last year. Then we looked at it and said, what happened to him? And now through 2 games, you're starting to scratch your head and say, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's a bit odd because he was so dominant this summer, enough so where and to a degree I still am. It's just 2 weeks into the season. I do believe that he has all-pro ability this year, but I got to tell you, he's been invisible through two weeks. And yes, he does get double teamed a ton, but you'd like to see a little bit more of an impact, especially when teams are really just running roughshod on you in the running game, and you're not really able to generate any sort of pressure in the passing game or move quarterbacks off their spots, or at least flash in some capacity. We haven't seen that. Same goes for Jordan Davis, but you asked me about Jalen Carter, and for me, I just think that getting double teamed like that sometimes you need somebody else to be able to step up and make a play, and the Eagles don't really have that Fletcher Cox that can maximize the not being double teamed and make a play. So I think that's where that's coming into play, and you're seeing you're seeing diminishing returns as a result.
All right, flip over the offense. No A.J. Brown. We don't anticipate. You're at practice. You did not see him at practice today, right?
No.
So most likely Brown out. What did they try to do last week to replace him?
Well, I mean, it was a heavy dose of Devontae. Devontae had 76 yards receiving. They got Cubby involved. He had 6 targets, 6 catches, 23 yards. They weren't able to generate much in terms of big plays or explosive plays. Jahan Dotson had 1 target for 6 yards. Some of these guys have to uncover a little bit better than they have, to be fair. I mean, the biggest surprise to me was the inefficiency of Dallas Goedert or the lack of involvement in the game plan or what have you. But there were times where he didn't necessarily get open. And remember, this has been a big point of emphasis when you're looking at Jalen Hurts and trying to find ways to utilize the middle of the field. He's going to have to do that against the Saints. And I think sometimes looking at it in terms of Goddard, when your game plan is sort of having to be altered at the 11th hour, sometimes you're not able to make the proper adjustments. And I think Dallas Goedert was, unfortunately, he was the odd man out last week. But I think this week you're going to see him. There's no reason why this week he shouldn't have 6 or 7 targets and Dotson have 4 targets. But that to me, I think Kellen Moore has to do a much better job of scheming players open. Looking at it from Cubby's perspective, a lot of his catches were horizontal. There was a player right there waiting to make the tackle. He only averaged 3.8 yards catch. With his skill set, his ability to have that short area quickness and burst in the open field, get him the ball in space and allow him to manufacture yards after the catch if you're trying to really maximize his skill set.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because so many times he catches the ball, and I don't mind, setting something up for Cubby. You got Devontae Smith as his lead blocker there, and I don't want to diminish Smith, but why do I want Smith blocking out in front? Get me somebody else out there that that can allow Britton Covey to use his speed and quickness in that area.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of folks will look to Johnny Wilson. Johnny Wilson played very sparingly in that game. You have to remember he was limited with a hamstring. Ordinarily, he's going to have a really big blocking role in this offense that the Eagles really like what he can bring in terms of that element. And I think that perhaps this week we'll have to see. He was at practice today participating in a limited capacity, it looked like. So I think that could open things up offensively perhaps. And I still would expect the offense to have a heavy dose of Devontae. Obviously, Goddard. Cubby's still going to be in the game plan, at least in my opinion, because he offers a different element, a different dimension than maybe a Dotson or what somebody else can. But you have to use him right. You have to get the ball in his hands where he's able to kind of run forward and get that first down. But obviously the passing game this week, Mike, has to go through Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert.
All right, let me get your thoughts then. Obviously, Barkley should be a big part of the offense. Should there be room to run on the ground? Can they run the ball against this Saints team? Which, by the way, I think the Saints defense is an underrated part about this team that's been scoring all these points.
Yeah, it really is. They're a gritty, tough defense, and it's so tough to play in the Superdome. It is loud. The crowd almost feels like they're on top of you. So it's kind of an intimidating place like that, and I think they really thrive off of, rallying to the football, getting a lot of hats on the ball carrier, and sometimes stuff, when they make plays like that, it kind of flips momentum. And to me, they're just a team that they play the game in a physical and nasty manner, and I think they're pretty keen on stopping the run. So to me, I don't know if that's going to be the avenue that they're going to find the most success. They're going to certainly have to try it, but they have a really good defense from front to back. the Eagles are going to have to get really creative, and it all starts with Kellen Moore, finding ways to scheme players open. But I would still expect them early on, at least, when it's loud and the crowd can kind of really gets behind it, for them to try to lean on Saquon and quiet down the noise.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, football at 4. And, of course, we've got plenty more on this game. Eagles and Saints will break it all down. But those are some of the big breakdowns in this matchup. And, of course, follow Andrew on the X platform, at Andrew DiCecco, Thursdays here on the Sports Bash for Football at 4. All right, brother, we'll talk to you next week.
See you, man.